Welcome, and thanks for having me here again. We had a similar session last year, and this is about operationalizing orchestration. Sometimes I struggle with the first word already, but today it went fine. And I just want to summarize on what we, a bit where we left it last year. And it was more or less a reflection or conclusion about a couple of things that we need to do, or why we need to do certain things, and what our findings are when we put automated and orchestrated services into production. And this is maybe just as good as a recap, to remind us a bit and see then what can we conclude today, departing from here. So first of all, of course, we automate because we want to scale, right? So this is not about a monolithic thing anymore that sits there somewhere in a corner. We want to move it out, and then we want to have things simpler. Simpler in a lot of directions, simpler processes. We want to have an end goal achieved faster. We need to automate, and we heard that a couple of times over the last 2 days. We want to, and we have to automate the full ecosystem. And that means not just a box or one certain process, right? There is more behind, and we will see today what that means. Of course, reducing touch points can be beneficial in many ways as well. Yeah, one is again speed. The other is eliminating the risk to end up with some errors or break things. And then, of course, what we recapped last year as well was a bit that this belongs to the ecosystem aspect. It's not just deploying something. We have to manage it and operate it. So we have to make sure that when we have to fix things, when we have to look at life cycle, this is very important as well, to not forget automation in those spaces. So this is about where we left it last year. And again, this session is not about business cases, not about architecture or modeling. I guess there is no lack of having those, and we saw many good talks here on that as well. This is really about some operational, so deployment-related aspects, and of course it is not about bits and bytes as well, just to frame the scope again. So, what is zero touch? This sounds like a ridiculous question, but I want to stress here a point that Peter already started to talk about yesterday. When we say zero touch is, let's add another definition, is the efficient, automated, and consistent way of deploying, say, a managed service, network, security, whatever. So this is a very high-level definition, but when we do this, when we say this with the eyes of a service provider or an operator, it does not mean the same thing compared to when a customer says this. Why is this? We talk maybe about some internal operational processes that we want to have more efficient. Yeah, that is why we do zero touch. Customers may see this with the eyes of, they want to see a benefit in their business, right? Whatever that is. It doesn't need to be commercial all the time, or not directly commercial, but indirectly, yeah, by process optimization. This may be an entirely different process compared to what we do. Just as an example, operators often talk about stop truck rolls. Customers may just want to have the freedom to decide themselves when to put a service into production. They don't rely on people coming to their site. They have to deal with them. They have to have somebody there who helps out, or they are restricted to a certain time or a day or whatever. They want to be more flexible. So this is customer zero touch. Now, when we accept that as a definition or as a fact, and it is a fact, then all of a sudden we figure out that this comes with a bunch of additional questions and problems that we have to solve. I'm not getting into everything here, but just a few examples. Look at collaterals that you have to do for zero touch. You have your own paperwork that is tailored around your field technicians. You cannot just reuse these for customers, right? Customers want to have the receptionist on Saturday installing a box. So you have to provide, eventually, on a per customer base, good material to help them do these things. We talk here enterprise. This is not consumer, right? So it's not as easy as installing a DSL modem. That's one thing. Then the other thing is, if you are in a telco operator or ISP environment, if you have a managed service, who can talk about what it means to install a service from a managed network service perspective? You have to do end-to-end testing. You have to call your NOC. You have to make sure they can see the device, it's accepted. If you have a third-party transport, you need to make sure that that works as well. Problems are then if the customer gets his own, say, broadband service. Yeah, you have to factor that in. You can handle this if humans are, being part of this exercise. What do you do if this is all automated? How do you handle end-to-end activation if the customer says, no, not today, tomorrow? Yeah? So these are problems that you need to solve. You need to think about that. And there are others, but I stop here. So another aspect is of this, you figure out, just by the last example that I said, the end goal is flexibility, but you may have to do a compromise, right? You cannot have all these manual, highly sophisticated things that you do in the physical manual world. You have, and this is not your own decision alone, it has to be something that is in your products, is in your processes, and that you talk about too with your customer, right? It may end up in a compromise, and that can be good or bad, it is not black and white. You have to understand the complexity, and then you can manage it. All right, so we talked a lot about automation and why do we do it, and it's all about the business outcome, right? And it's all about the customer experience. It is about some internal things as well, but we do it for our customers primarily to help them doing their business, running their business smoother, be more efficient and flexible. And what does this mean? Let's assume again we talk zero touch. Yeah. So this is all relevant and needed for the customer experience. It's not just about delivering a box and having it installed in a very fast and quick way. Yeah. We have to deal with the access. We have to understand that there is potentially a higher level application where zero touch, policy management, policy deployment is relevant as well. And while you talk here about zero touch for a universal CPE, the customer is not really interested in technology alone. Yeah? He wants to see the end result. And this customer experience is really then as good as your weakest link in that chain. That determines how well you succeed. And then, of course, it's not just that you need to take all these aspects into consideration. You also need to be prepared that they come in a certain order. And that order is relevant as well. You need to be as modular as possible here in order to allow flexibility in what you do, yeah? But then still have control over what happens. So maybe another view. We heard this quite a few times. The situation is not easy. As we grow, as we add services, we may see a complex situation to manage. In 2016, when we departed from this journey, we departed from an atmosphere of fog. It was all gray. Everything was easy to understand because there was not a lot, right? In the meantime, we are getting closer. And what does that mean? While we approach the surface of the moon, we see the rocks, we see, the landscape. So how do we manage this situation? Do we manage it by looking at an individual stone, or do we try to explain and work the whole landscape? Let me give you one example what this means. We talked about zero-touch provisioning, and we talked about a device that needs to be installed and potentially some transport service next to that, and that can be a customer-provided broadband service, right? Typically, how these services are being delivered is by providing a modem. So you have private addresses, network address translation, fine, DHCP runs, you get an IP address. The box gets connected, it calls home, it downloads the code, it does all these nice things. That is zero-touch provisioning. Great so far. Now, all of a sudden, we have to accept the fact how IBS services are being deployed mostly today. Who is aware about the implications that come with symmetric network address translation? This is the typical setup that is being used in most services, right? And it means that you have always, a new source port when you send out a packet and you try to reach a destination, right? This changes by destination. This has the implication that when you do that, and your other side is behind the symmetric NAT router as well, those two sides will never be able to talk to each other. Yeah? As a consequence, and I just switch back, if you have SD-WAN as a service, you need to accept for that. That if you have branch-to-branch traffic, that will not work in these environments. Is it a problem? Maybe, maybe not. It pretty much depends how your SD-WAN setup looks. If it's all hub-to-spoke traffic, you are good. If it's spoke-to-spoke traffic or fully meshed, you may be still okay if your network is having enough bandwidth, right? Or if your traffic pattern is kind of, defined in a way that is not having any impact. So you see how much we departed with just listening now the implications and consequences of zero touch, just by the fact that we added a service, an IBS service to that, and we added SD-WAN into the picture. We are not talking about ZTP at all. That's fine, yeah? But your ecosystem is complex, and you have to understand those complexities. And once you acknowledge that this is the surface of the moon, and that all these bits and pieces are the things that you need to take care of, then you can find ways to deal with that. All right, so we said that we will be looking a bit at some things that are on our virtualization trajectory, where we see more and more things getting virtualized, smaller entities. There is more decomposition here in this space. That means we end up with smaller things. We depart from this physical, monolithic type of applications into microservices and all of that, nanoservices. It doesn't really matter whether this is containers or something else. That's just an example, to really summarize maybe a bit about some of these findings when we talk ecosystem and when we talk about what do we need to take care from an operational standpoint when we want to manage and orchestrate this full ecosystem. So these services are, and who in this room does not know how containers or what containers are and how they operate and all of that? Just don't be shy. I assume that most of you do, so that's fine. So this is a process, right? It's not a virtual machine. It is a process. You spin it up, it does something, and typically afterwards, it's being killed or deleted. So it is something that you can spin up very quickly. You can have many of them, or ideally you will have many of them, because this is something that you usually do when you want to scale. Yeah? And then, of course, your management has to reflect all that. So highly dynamic environment, yeah? And it's maybe a good point in time to reflect a bit on some of the operational aspects of this when we say manage conflict, DevOps, network ops, because containers, IT, it's the perfect thing there. They have a compute job to do. They don't want to invest into servers and all of that, so they just spin up something quickly, do their exercise, what they want to do some testing of an application, and then they move on to the next thing. From a network ops perspective, this is not funny, yeah, because they want predictability. So if we just continue with our moon landscape example, right? If you have a lump of a rock, a really heavy thing, do you like your operations like that? They love it, right? Because it's very, you still have to understand its mechanics. It can be huge and very predictable in the other way, right? So there are not a lot of things that happen to such a big rock. Yeah, it's sitting there. You can put a guy next to it. It's looking at it, and everything is good. Now, if you just, in analogy to these virtualized services, you just take a handful of pebble stones, what do you do with them? You can put them next to that big rock and have the same guy watching at them, right? This is typically how we do from physical to virtual. We copy things we did in the physical world, right? So that's fine. Nothing will happen. Yeah, you have your pebbles there. The mistake would be to stop here, because now we need to see with your pebbles. You can just put 5 in your left and 5 in your right pocket. You can lose them if you are not paying attention. Somebody can get them, even throw them at you, yeah, or replace them by plastic pellets. All these things can happen. So what I want to say here, by decomposition and by virtualizing these services, we create a challenge for network operations, but for security as well. Yeah? You have a lot of new options how you can, do things, but also, of course, your risk goes up. So this is something that you have to be very clear about. This is, again, not just about containers. It applies in general. Yeah? And if we talk about data, it is very clear that you also need to understand your data model. Not only that, you need to understand what is the data you want to base your monitoring on, right? I mean, it can be many things that you collect data from, but how do you put them in relation? How do you synchronize that data? Yeah? And what is relevant and what is not relevant? So I heard a lot about content-based orchestration and automation, and I think we really need to start to also reflect a bit on content-based data generation and intent-based data generation. What is that? Once you have your data, you need to do something with it, right? Either you manage it, you base intelligent decisions on it, but you have it. And then in a best case or in a worst case, you can throw it away if you don't need it. So much better to not even generate it, right? Think about where do you need data and what do you do with that data. That is imminent for this environment as well. So, what do we conclude? And if you recall our first slide, we saw that there is not one definition of what automation, orchestration, or zero touch can do. Pretty much depends on the business outcome. And if we put our customer first, then it is all about automating to the need of the real-time enterprise. That is why we do things fast, predictable, consistent. We have to do this in a way that we have right data, yeah, that we do intelligent decisions based on our data. And then it is all about the ecosystem, right? It is not just about the CPE. It is about the network. It is about how we craft and tailor our services, managed, co-managed, bring your own appliance, bring your own hardware, bring your own transport. These are all things that we see from our customers. It's adding to the ecosystems. It's not just about customer relationship anymore. They become partners to a certain extent with many things. So it's about the service itself. It's about all this decomposition that I was just, with containers as an example, elaborating on. And then we have, of course, to make sure that it's the service chain and the application that sits on top. This is where automation and zero touch at the end have to find their home. So I'm well ahead of time. That was the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Sure.
Questions? Thanks. James Crawshaw, Heavy Reading. So what sort of applications are you using today that are microservices based and you're running in containers? And then following on from that, what sort of applications are you using today which are virtualized and running in virtual machines? If you could talk about some real applications.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you had the option to listen to what Peter said yesterday. I use here containers just as an example. I'm not talking here about containers being part of a specific applications, because we would have to look at what every vendor is doing. So we have a lot of network vendors, security vendors that are part of this virtual network services portfolio that we have. We have various service chains, where you have routing, security, WAN optimization, all of these things. partially these come with controllers that are from our vendors, so we host them, we run them, we manage them, and we do not even have insight into what technology they do to deploy these things, right? But that was not my point. Containers is really just an example for a microservice. I could have used a virtual machine or anything else, but I used containers to make the point because it is a highly agile and volatile environment, and the thing is just that your operations has to be able to deal with that.
Another question?
So just want to know, okay, when we talk about the containers, talk about the decomposition of the networks, then you tell us there are many new challenges with this new architecture, with containers, with microservices. So could you tell me what detail about these new challenges?
I'm not sure I understood the question. So the challenges are in essence system immanent, right? There is not something specific. It's just by the fact that you have defragmentation. Take containers again as an example, right? If you look from a monolithic standpoint, your operations had to manage just one piece, right? In this piece of whatever it was of application, you had a database, there was everything that would become now a virtual network was built in that monolithic thing. Just by defragmentation, you end up with many endpoints that you interconnect. Yeah. That has to be put now from an operational management perspective into a perspective that you need to pay attention now about just a simple example, a vSwitch, a virtual internal network. Yeah, if you talk about virtualization, that was not there before. Yeah, so that is not a challenge, it is just a fact, right? And my point is we all need to be aware that there is an ecosystem that requires to be looked at and not just an individual silo.
Okay, thank you.